to our Primate Conversation series, today with Dr. Barbara Klump. Dr. Klump is part of the MPI for Animal Behavior in Lucy Aplin's group, and she, before starting her work now with cockatoos, was working with different crow species, which is going to be the work she's going to present to us today, work she did at the University of St. Andrews. And after we were talking about monkeys living on islands a couple of weeks ago and using tools there, today we're going to talk about crows living on islands using tools as well. So we have some kind of nice continuity in our series. And with that, I'll be handing over to Dr. Klump, and she'll be telling us all about crow tool use.
Well, thank you very much for this kind introduction, and I'm very excited to share some of the crow work with you. As Alex said, this is work I've did while I was at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and of course I didn't do all of this work myself. So, okay, let's see, doesn't want to, there we go. So I would like to take the opportunity to thank all the people who have actually made all this work possible. So first and foremost, my PhD supervisor, Professor Christian Rutz, and also the other lab members of the Rutz group, field assistants, of course, and also our local supporters in New Caledonia and our funding bodies. So I thought I'd just start with some very broad and general things that I'm interested in. So I'm interested in behavioral variation and especially sources of variation. And we know that a lot of different factors contribute to variation in behavior. So we have genes, ecological drivers, individual learning, and also social learning. And it's not one of these, but most of the time, or almost all of the time, an interplay between all of these factors. But I've got quite interested in the ecological drivers because I feel this is a very interesting subject, and that there is, and it's often something that people try to exclude, for example, when looking at sources of behavior, because it's so, there is so much variation in the ecology. But I think this is really a very interesting part to look at. So, for today, I chose a bit of a different approach. So I thought, what am I interested in with the crows? Of course, in their tool using behavior, but one particular tool type, and that's the hook tool. So why do I want to talk about hook tools? When we think about our own evolutionary history, hooks were really one of the key technological innovations in the Middle Stone Age, and it really set us on a trajectory when we look at our own tool using journey, so to say, because it helped us to develop a productive fishing technology, and also suddenly we had weapons with really enhanced killing powers. And this is actually evolutionary seen, a relatively recent innovation. So the first barb edge tools were used about 90,000 years ago, and the first fish hooks, which you can see here, not the one in the middle, that's a later one, but the two on the outside, that's a fish hook made out of seashell about 23,000 years ago. So 23,000 years in evolutionary terms, that's not very long. It's about 1,000 generations, and humans went from this fish hook to me talking to you via the internet from a computer. So it's quite a drastic journey we've gotten past in these relatively short times. So this brings me to my study species, the New Caledonian crow, because they are the only known non-human species who also craft hooks. So that makes it quite special, and that's, I think, also what sparked my interest in this particular tool type. So they live on an island in the South Pacific, and they use a variety of different foraging tools. So in this graph you see on the left, relatively simple stick tools, and then the other tool types are hook tools. The one on the right are pandanus tools. So these are tools that are cut out of the leaf edges of screw pine leaves, and they have barbs because the leaf edge is already barbed, and they use those barbs as hook. But I want to talk about the middle one. So that's a hooked stick tool, and it really looks like a crochet hook, and the crows actively craft and manufacture and make this hook. And I think that that's what really is the special thing. When we think about like tool-oriented behavior in general, there's of course many species that use tools, so sticks for extracting embedded arthropods, for example, or honey, but also stones to break open really hard-shelled items, so nuts, eggs, or mollusks. And all of these behaviors, of course, give you access to otherwise unavailable prey items, and they are usually very nutritious. So it's a very beneficial behavior to use tools. But on the other hand, it's also quite time and energy. It's a big time and energy investment, and that's what I gotten quite interested in. So when we think about this hook tool, for example, you first need to find the material to make this tool. And then, so you pay some search costs. Then you also need to make it. So you pay some manufacture costs, and then you will use it, and that can be quite difficult. And then it also comes to the question of like what happens with the tool afterwards, after you've paid all of these costs. How can you like keep or get the most out of this tool? And that's sort of like the journey that I want to take you on today with this talk. So starting with the search costs, I asked myself, how do New Caledonian crows select raw material for this particular tool type, the hooked stick tool? So they want to make this tool, but how do they find it? So you have to imagine the habitat that this particular population that I worked on is living in is a dry forest, so paperbark trees, like in the figure, the yellow part of the figure. So big trees, but then also, of course, lots of like grasses and bushes. And I just asked myself, like, how do they actually find material to make this particular tool type? So we know from previous work that they have a very strong site-specific preference for the material they make these tools out of. So they don't just use any material, but each population seems to have like one particular type. And this population, they really like an invasive shrub. It's called Desmanthus virgatus, and it's shown in panel 3, like the green, with the green border. And I'm gonna go into a bit more detail about how they make these tools later on. But for now, I just wanted to point out that they make them from a forked branch. So that's the illustration on the left. And you can see the yellow part is like where the later hook tool is if you just look at the fork. So I asked myself, it is quite difficult to actually find this particular species in the forest when there are so many options available. And I asked myself, how do the crows recognize it? Like what are they looking for? And I picked two key features, and that's the stem, because I thought, yeah, that's obviously the part that will later be the tool, so that might be important, but also the leaves, because that's something like more conspicuous. If you like go through or fly as a crow through the forest, that might be easier to spot. So we came up with a choice experiment where we asked basically what the crows are looking for. So I just wanted to run you through the different treatments we did. So just as a little bit of a background information, all of the work I'm going to present today is with temporarily captive crows. So those are wild New Caledonian crows that we trapped and then had in like short-term captivity in aviaries for a couple of weeks, where they where we could do the behavioral experiments, and then they were released again. So the first thing, of course, I wanted to establish that actually these crows also really prefer the Desmanthus virgatus species over the others. So we gave them 3 options. So one is, the green one is the Desmanthus virgatus, the yellow one is the paperbark, which is like the most prevalent in this area, and then we also know that sometimes the crows there make hook tools out of this material. And then the middle one is one species that I chose because it has very similar leaves to the Desmanthus virgatus. So I thought this might be a good way to see whether they pay attention to the leaves. And then, of course, we wanted to see whether they do pay attention to the leaves. So what we did was like graft the leaves of 2 species onto the stems of the 3rd one. The same for the stems. So here they got the choice between their preferred stem and another stem, and they both had the leaves of the paper bark. Then, of course, at the end, we first want to make sure that the crows are still motivated. So if they didn't do anything, that it wasn't due to motivational issues, but also that they still have the preference for Desmanthus virgatus, because we presented them with plants that they would never encounter in the wild. So I think it's important to make sure that we didn't alter their preference. And then we also had a box treatment where in one box they could only see leaves from the front, and in the other one only the stems. And the idea behind this was that maybe they use a 2-step approach. So you could imagine that they fly through the forest, see the leaves, which are more obvious, and then only when they basically go down and have a closer look, then they look at the stems. So what did we find? So first, good thing was like all of the crows that we tested, they really liked the Desmanthus. So they really had a strong preference for it, and that preference got retained also in the control treatment afterwards. You remember that like one hypothesis was that they will look for the stems because that's part of the tool later on. And that was actually the case. So most birds chose this stem even if it had other leaves on it. The interesting one is the leaves treatment. So we didn't find a strong preference there. But if you look at the actual sample sizes, it was mostly because the birds didn't want to interact with this treatment at all. So if they interacted, they all chose the one with the leaves of the preferred species. So I think that, yes, they can probably recognize it, but they also recognize that these stems were not what they were after, and they were just like not interacting with it. What didn't work out was the box treatment. So we didn't find anything there, very low sample sizes again. And I think that was a combination of one being like a lot of birds were like not keen on approaching these boxes. But I also think like once they went behind the box, there was obviously no difference between any of those stems. And we couldn't really say what they were choosing. So this really showed that like, while it seems really difficult to find the correct species in such an environment, they can identify the preferred species by the stem alone and possibly also by their leaves. And they seem to have like this search image to actually identify what they want, which I find quite interesting. So if we look again at this, what I call like the life cycle of a crow's tool, so now the crow has the right material. And the next question is like, now how do they make these tools? So if we look at the manufacture process, we found that there is like 2 different main ways of getting the stem out of the, like the tool out of the forked stem. And that's by either cutting above and below the joint, or by pulling on the tool shaft. And with this plant species, that will also result in a little hook at the end. And then they go on and like refine it and really craft the hook. So when we looked at the behavioral variation over time, so our field seasons were a bit different in those years. So one started earlier, the other one ran later. And without going into too much detail, the top panel in this figure just shows you like lots of different colored blobs that represent different actions within the manufacture sequence. So each column is like one manufacture sequence. And when we look at, for example, like 2 key measures that we took, which is one in panel B, the diameter of the stem, and then in panel C, the time it took them to actually get this, what we call like a basic tool out of the stem, then we found that it's different over the season. And that really sparked my interest, and I wondered why. And it got me thinking that actually the raw material should have an influence on the morphology and the behavior, and they should all be interacting. And it's a very obvious source of variation. But when I went to have a look in the literature, there is not as much as you might think. So I found, for example, like a study in zebra finches, and they found that the nests look different if you give them stiff string or if you give them like floppy string. And another study in caddisfly larvae, where when you deprive them of their preferred material, they will still build cases, but they will look different. So there is some suggestion that, yes, the material actually influences sort of like the end product. If we look at human tool making, there is like mixed evidence. So some studies showed that, yes, the material will influence the, for example, like the flake breakage patterns, but also some other studies showing that if you have a really skilled person, they can make indistinguishable stone tools out of different materials. So again, I think there's a lot of like interplay happening, but the raw material was the one that I was particularly interested in. So I wanted to know whether this is also the case in New-Caledonian crows, and asked whether the raw material properties influence the manufacture process. So for this, I gave the crows again a choice experiment, but it was like slightly different. So they got 8 stems at a time, all from their preferred species. And the material ranged from a material score of like 1, which was like really thin and flimsy, to a material score of 8, which was like really rigid and thick. Then they got to choose, make a tool, extract a prey, and then like a piece of meat. That's what I refer to as prey here in a log. And then we would take that tool away, and they got to choose again. So what did we find? The first and maybe a little bit surprising thing was that actually the material predicted whether they made a hooked stick tool or not. So some birds made non-hooked stick tools out of this material, so just like simple sticks. And that was really never the case in the middle of the range, which was matched onto crow tools that we had found in the wild, but it was more at like either end of the spectrum. So that was the first interesting thing. But then if we look more into the detail of the manufacture process, if they made a hooked stick tool, then we could see that there is a very, very strong preference for the ones in the middle of the spectrum. So here you see, again, on the x-axis, it's the material score, and then on the y-axis, which stem they chose, in which order. And you can see that like they really like the one in the middle, and then when they were not available anymore, they would go out. And it also shows that they can make tools, hooked stick tools, out of all these materials, but they really prefer the ones in the middle. When we look more into the actual manufacture sequence, we found that the number of behavioral actions to make this tool was influenced by the raw material, the time that they needed to take out this basic tool out of the stem. So again, they were fastest with the one in the middle. And then what I found really interesting, so that's the figure in the bottom right, that's a subset of all the tools. So this is the ones where the first action is a cut at the hook tool, but that doesn't release the tool. And if we then look at like what's the next step, we really see that it splits into these 2 alternative methods of releasing the tool. So if the material score, so if the material was rather thin, they would cut, and if it was rather thick, they would pull. So that really shows that there is an influence of the material in how they make the tool. Why is this interesting? In another study, we also looked at this and looked at, so this cut or pull, which you see in panel B, but then also how this actually relates to the tools they make. So in terms of like how long they are and how deep the hook is. So there is an influence also on what the tool in the end will look like. Not only how they make it, but also what it will look like. So there is a strong influence on these material properties on like tool type, manufacture method, and the morphology. So going one step further, this was a study led by James St. Clair. The question, of course, is now they went through all this effort of like finding this material and not just picking up any stick, and then going through this elaborate process of like manufacturing a hooked stick tool. Is it any good? Like, does it actually make you make a better foraging tool? So to look at that, we had different setups. So I just want you to focus on the two solid lines. So the red one is a simple stick tool, so no hook or anything. And the solid blue one is the hooked stick tool where the crows made their hooks themselves, just as I had shown before. And then we looked at the foraging performance. So how quickly do they actually get out the prey? So here on the x-axis, you have the time in seconds. And on the y-axis, it's like basically a survival analysis where we looked at how long does it take the crows to get all of the prey out, which would be the one at the top. And what you can see here is that really the blue solid line is much, much higher, much faster. They get all the prey out than the solid red line. So it's really like, it makes it much, much faster to forage with a hook tool. So they have like a good, the efficiency is much, much better. Sorry about that. So going back to this other study, we also looked at how these fine scale differences in the hook morphology actually influence the tool performance. And we can see there that also these morphological differences that partly come from the raw material also transfer into the tool performance. So they all like, it's all one big circle, if you want to say. So yeah, so it really is beneficial for the crows to use a hooked stick tool because the foraging is a lot faster than if you forage with a non-hooked stick tool. So now we're at a stage where you went through the search cost and the manufacture cost, and then you deployed the tool, and it's a good tool, but like, how can you minimize all the costs you paid to that point? So the things that of course come to mind is like, you could use it repeatedly, then you don't have to make a new one every time. You can transport it between foraging sites, and then you could also keep them safe when you don't need it. And that was what I wanted to investigate. So whether the crows would increase what we call safekeeping behavior, so looking after their tools when either the cost or the likelihood of losing this tool are high. So normally, at this point, I show a little video, but in my experience over Zoom, that's sometimes a bit difficult. So I'm just going to tell you what that video shows. So it's a video of a New Caledonian crow, wild New Caledonian crow in the forest. And you see it foraging with a hook tool high up in the canopy. And then it puts its tool aside and then probes a bit more. And then you see the tool falling down. And the crow gets really upset. So it starts calling a lot and then eventually it flies off. But I think the key point here is really that we often saw that like they get really upset when they lose their tools. So if we think about what would make, like, what are the costs and like the likelihood of like losing a tool, because that's obviously something they don't want to, like they don't want to lose their tool. And I think that's quite relatable if you think about you're climbing up a ladder and you drop your hammer and then you have to go down again. That's quite annoying. So we came up with an experimental design that really picked on two factors that I think are important in the foraging ecology of the New Caledonian crow. So one is that they use tools both on the ground and also high up in the canopy. And we basically mimic that by giving them extraction tasks once on the ground and then once on an elevated log. And the other thing is that they extract a variety of prey items, and some of them they can just eat, and others, for example, like if they get a cricket out, they gut them. So they need to process them. And this is something where I think bird or avian tool users are really excellent to investigate this question, because if you compare them to ourselves or to chimpanzees or other primates, they hold their tool in their bill. So if they extract anything, they need to do something with that tool. They cannot just like hold it in one hand and like eat with the other. They need to put it somewhere, and that's something we can investigate. So the second thing we did was look at prey handling difficulty. So we had some easy prey where they could just like, it was just a piece of meat and they could eat it. And then the difficult condition, we wrapped a piece of chicken fat around it and they don't like it. So they will like remove that before eating it. So, and then we scored after each extraction, what they did with their tool. So let's first look at the elevated versus the ground condition. So everything in red here is unsecure placement, and everything in blue is safe placement. And so each column is one bird, and then the last column to the right is sort of like a summary across all birds. And if you have a look, you can see that there is way more blue in the elevated condition. So in the elevated condition, they were much more likely to put their tools either underfoot or in a hole and like keep it safe that way. What we also found was that there was also, if we look at like the mode of safekeeping rather than just like the overall level, that they were more likely to insert the tools into holes. And there was also less tool dropping. And I think that's interesting because I just feel like that shows that like on the ground, they really didn't care because there was not much cost involved. They could just like bend down and pick it up again. But if you're higher up, and in our experimental condition, it wasn't actually that high. It was like 1.3 meters, but it was high enough for them to be much more careful when handling their tools. So when we look at easy prey and versus difficult prey, we found that there was more safekeeping when handling easy prey. So this was something we didn't expect at all. We expected that if you have difficult prey, you're much more careful and you put the tool somewhere safe and then you process it. But that wasn't the case. And so we asked ourselves why that was. And one interesting thing we found is that overall, they really like to foot trap. So they just put the tool under the foot and step on it. And we think that has something to do with it's being safe there, usually also from conspecifics who could, for example, like come and steal it. But of course, when you're handling difficult prey, that makes it cognitively quite demanding. You need to like look after the tool and also handle the prey. And oftentimes they fail then. Because what we also found is like that they were more likely to put the tools in the holes when they were handling difficult prey. They just didn't manage when they were foot trapping. So this was sort of like the round of like the life cycle of a crow's hook tool. So the search costs that they're paying and how they can identify the preferred species by just simple key features, for example, the stem alone. There is a lot of influence of the material properties when they actually make their tools, but tools, there's a hook, are beneficial over non-hooked stick tools. And yes, they do seem to look after their tools very carefully, especially when like the likelihood or the cost of losing it is high. So this is sort of like the end of the crow story, but I just wanted to go back to this initial figure and very briefly tell you what I'm working on right now. So as I told you, I've always been interested in like the ecological drivers, and I'm still working on that. but I'm also working on social learning increasingly more. And I'll do this in Lucy Aplin's group at the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior. I'm working on these sulfur-crested cockatoos in Sydney, looking at their foraging ecology and especially also foraging traditions, so see whether they socially learn and how these behaviors potentially get passed on via social learning. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and I'm very happy to take any questions.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Barbara. That was absolutely fantastic. I love this approach where you take the natural history and the ecology and you turn it into actual experiments that make sense from the animal's point of view, with actual animals who have to use these techniques every day, because you get such a rich source of information, really, and it actually matches what we would expect. Yeah. So that's absolutely lovely. I love this approach. So super interesting. We do have a lot of questions, and they are mainly by people working with primates, so they will be very primate skewed. So maybe let's start with the big question. Obviously, they seem to portray or show some kind of very deep understanding of the tools, the tool materials, of the prey. So that, you know, there seems to be some kind of insight, or at least some very, very detailed knowledge of all of these properties. How do they learn this? So is this something, you know, because with the Hawaiian crows, you show that they all kind of learn it, whether they have social contact or not. But this seems so complex to learn on your own. What do you think?
Yeah, so with the hooked stick tools, we don't know yet. So that's the very short answer. But the longer answer is, of course, that we do know that the New Caledonian crows have a genetic predisposition. So there have been experiments in captivity that show that they will develop functional tool use even without a tutor. But it also showed that they will that there is some enhancement if they have a tutor. So what we think is, as with a lot of other things, I guess as well, is they do have this genetic predisposition, but there will be some social learning involved. It's just really tricky to tease that apart, and we haven't done that with the hooked stick tools. We also don't know, so we had some very young birds in aviaries, and some of them could make perfectly fine hook tools. But by young, I mean, they were still juveniles, but they were trapped without their parents. So they had some level of independence, right? So we don't have data on when they're really, really young. What we do know is that New Caledonian crows stay with their parents for a long period. So up to 2 years, which for a bird is very, very long. And so they have a lot of opportunities to observe other, their parents mainly, to use tools. But yeah, we don't know yet what the different relative contributions are to the development of this behavior.
And then, given the current state of the art and your knowledge about these species and the literature about primates, what do you think are the similarities and differences between this crow tool use and what we see in great apes and in other primates?
I mean, I'm of course much more familiar with the bird literature than with the, so I can tell you from the bird view, it's always, or why I find it interesting to study also then in comparison to the primate literature is because with the primates, of course, we will always have this, which in lots of cases is an advantage, but it can also in some cases be a disadvantage, I think, that we're so closely related to them, right? So when we want to think about the broader, for example, ecological factors that facilitate tool use, it might be a really good idea to go as far away as you can, or at least further away, and look at some crows on islands and see what's special there and why did they develop tool use. Because I think we can all agree on that it's very unlikely that the last common ancestor between the New Caledonian crows and chimpanzees probably didn't use tools. So I think it's just like a different approach, but also ultimately going at like the same questions. Yeah.
Very nice. We have a question asking whether, if you look at the cut versus pull method in some of your studies, were you looking at the method that was ultimately successful, or are you also looking at the one they tried? Because it could obviously be that in the harder sticks, only one method works, whereas in the softer sticks, the other method works better. Or they immediately go for the right method.
So this one is the one that ultimately worked, but yes, it is the case that in a lot of the cases when they tried either really flimsy one or the really hard one, just the one that they wanted to didn't work. So that is ultimately, I think, what we're also wanting to hint at with this study is that sometimes you have to take into account the sort of like restrictions that are already in place because of the material you're using. So if I was to do a study and I'm giving crows material that's all very thick, they might not want to pull and make like these tools that have a certain morphological structure, but the material just doesn't allow them to do anything else. And they will end up with either no tool or just this one. So I think that that's really like one of the key points that we should look very carefully on what's sort of like also driven by the material that's either given in a like or chosen by an animal when they make tools.
And do you see inter-individual differences in their preference, and how stable are they? So if you go out for several field seasons, I think you showed, do you work with the same animals over and over again? And do you feel that like they have differences in how good they are, and they have difference in preference? And are there sex differences, for example? Or how does it work?
Yeah, so this is a very good question. So we go out every year, like if there is not a pandemic, and the birds are obviously, as I said, those are wild animals. They are marked, but it's just who can we grab. And we do have a few individuals that we have in multiple years, but I don't think we've looked at their preference or their manufacture method over multiple years. It's a really, really interesting question. And I think my hunch is that probably the data set would be very, very small, but I still think it would be a really good idea to look at it. Same as the sex differences. That's always been something that we thought would be really great to do, but currently just the sample size is very small still. But I think that's definitely something to learn more in the future. Also with every field season, the chance of like getting some birds back will become bigger, and then over time there will be a data set where we can look at these things. And I think this would be extremely interesting and enlightening.
Do you have seasonal changes in the material? Because the sticks get drier or wetter, and they will, it might change which tool is useful at what point of the year.
Yeah, so not on an annual cycle, but definitely within our sort of like field season, we could show that there is a difference. And it's also what we sort of like experience when we go out and we collect this material, and we try to standardize it as much as possible, obviously, but it becomes, so in the beginning of the season, it's much more difficult because most stems you find are still like too thin, or you find like really thick ones from the previous season. And then it gets suddenly like much easier to find them, and you think like, now I've nailed it, I can just go out and collect all of the material. But then at the end of the season, it gets much harder again. So while of course in an experimental context, we can still standardize it, and that's what we try to do at least. It's still not 100%, of course, but also I think it just reflects what the crows actually deal with in their environment, because they will, even though I still think they are probably much, much better than any of us in finding those stems, but they will still also experience this sort of like fluctuation of it getting easier to get like really good tool material and then getting more difficult again.
Do they ever steal each other's tools? Do you see theft?
Yes, we do. We have some observations of it. I mean, it's always really hard to say, is it theft? Is it tool sharing, right? But we do see some crows like going and picking up another tool from another crow, yeah.
And maybe quickly shifting to the cockatoos, because you have the citizen science project now, right? How does this work? Because these projects are so fascinating, and they can deliver so much information. Like, what are you doing with these cockatoos?
Yeah, so if we talk about like the citizen science approach, we briefly talked about it before while we were setting up, and I was saying like we couldn't go back to the field this year, but we've just launched a new app where people can report not only cockatoos, but it's called the Big City Birds app. So all big birds in the city. And you can take a picture of a bird that you see and then choose like where you've seen it, what was it doing. We're trying to collect information on, for example, their foraging ecology. So what are they feeding on? Also some social information, because we have some wing-tagged birds there, but we also have some painted birds that we painted while we were out there, and people can like take a picture and say like this bird was chasing away this other bird. And we hope that over time, and a lot of people engage with this, then we can like build a data set that we can actually evaluate whether there are differences, for example, in different parts of the city or different habitat structures, things like that. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. This sounds so interesting. We also have more questions pouring in, so I think we all need to keep you a tiny bit longer.
That's fine.
There is a question now whether you have an idea what the average amount of time or the maximum amount of time is that they carry those tools. You know, because chimpanzees, we know, can carry theirs 200 meters, and sometimes they really hold on to it. If they really like a tool, what is the situation with the crows?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we haven't been able to do like a study on it. So it's mostly anecdotal, and I can't really tell you, oh, they carry it for so and so long or this and this far. We can only say that like sometimes we see crows, and also we like find crows sometimes, for example, bring their tools to the trap site, and the tools just look like really, really worn. And I think that's an indication that they have been using them quite a bit. But whether that's like hours or days, we don't know. I also think that like the cost, of course, I've talked a lot about costs, and I think these costs are important, but also a New Caledonian crow, if it finds a stem, it takes them a couple of minutes to make a tool. So it's not like an investment of like hours and hours. So I feel as long as there is enough raw material available in the environment, they could just go and make a new tool if they need one. But on these shorter bouts, so maybe that's important to point out, I didn't say it during the talk. So when we investigated the safekeeping in the aviary setting, we also looked at some of our wild bird observations, and we also find exactly the same modes to roughly the same distribution also in the wild. So if we look at extractions in the wild, they will also keep their tools safe. And I think that just shows that it is really something that, especially if they're sort of like foraging and they get something out, they're really likely to look after that tool. Not sure once they're like sort of done and then really go do something else, whether they then keep their tools, but on the short-term scale, they do it, yeah.
Then maybe one last question. Do you observe trial and error learning? So if you have young crows, do they go about just poking hooks and trying to make hooks, or they just suddenly make the perfect hook and work with that?
Yeah, really good question. I don't know. So what we do in the aviaries, we have sort of like a pre-testing assessment. So they get material in their housing aviaries, lots of material and extraction tasks. And only if they do produce hook tools in this trial period, they actually move on to the experiments. And that's really important because we don't want to expose them in the experiments to anything, or especially like a tool type that they're not already using in the wild. But of course, that means that we don't know how it develops because either the birds show this behavior in the pre-assessment period and then they move on, or they don't and then they get released. So, but I agree, that would be a really, really fascinating thing to find out. Yeah.
Well, thank you again very much, Barbara. This was incredibly fascinating. For all of you watching, join us again next week when we'll be discussing, I think, lemurs in lemur conservation in Madagascar. So thanks again, Dr. Barbara Klump, and see you all again next week.
Thank you.